I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic threw their plans against us.
All of a sudden, a stick out of nowhere landed right in front of us, and there was no tree, nothing overhead. Something threw it at us.
Yeah.
All things unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounce's books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show.
Hello there, Unexplained Ones. Welcome to this episode of All Things Unexplained. I'm your host, Dr. Mounce, and this episode was a part of UFO Twitter Week 2024. Big thanks to Astral, aka @the_Astral on Twitter, for inviting us to join the festivities. Today's episode is all about one of the most iconic events in UFO history, Roswell. I'm thrilled to be joined by the one and only Paul T. Simons, the mastermind behind the Roswell UFO tour. You can follow him on Twitter @PaulTiberius, and be sure to check out his fascinating tours at RoswellUFOtour.com. Pay attention to this episode because Paul even has a special opportunity for you later in the podcast. Since this was recorded live on Twitter Spaces, the audio will sound a little different than usual, and you'll hear from some amazing voices across UFO Twitter throughout the episode. We're diving straight in with Paul sharing a strange and recent encounter that took place on one of his tours, with Astral leading off the conversation. So sit back, grab some Halloween candy, and prepare to be amazed. It's time for All Things Roswell.
Hey, so Astral, I had reason to think about you yesterday. I had the first person ever take my tour who came up to me afterwards and said that they were a remote viewer. I don't want to violate any privacy, but the interesting interaction was that after the tour, this person comes up and tells me that they had said to their companion, just as the tour started, this is an afternoon tour, she said, at 4:44, we are going to be at someplace important. Okay, guess where we were at 4:44? I was just pulling up into the gravel, messy lot that is all that remains of the hospital where the bodies would have been examined. And she had been, I just gave something away. So this tour customer, she had been reading up on the alien interview, not the video, but the alleged book from someone named Matilda O'Donnell McElroy, and she was all into that, so her brain was perfectly in tune with the idea of a living creature that was communicating, right? And so then as a remote viewer, she says that before the tour, 4:44, it's going to be the moment. Sure enough, that's where we pulled up at the old hospital grounds. I had no idea, she tells me this afterwards, but I told her straight up, I want to take some remote viewers out to some locations. I will not tell them where we are. There's no indication of what the place is on its face when you arrive. I want to take them out to some places and just see if they have any impressions, any sense that, this is indeed where bodies were. To be fair, I am not, as people say of me, I don't have the woo, right? I don't really know the ins and outs and the rules of remote viewing. I mean, just as we had this conversation yesterday after the tour, her companion was telling me, kind of don't tell her anymore if you want her to go look at something. That's not really how it works. So I don't really know the rules and the ins and outs and kind of what the expectations are. But I just want to take somebody, stand in the exact physical location where alien bodies allegedly would have been handled and examined. Don't tell them that's where they are. There's no reason for them to think that's what it would be if they haven't studied the physical space of the old base, and just see what impression do they get. And like afterwards, I gave her a homework assignment too. I said, here's an address. It was like 3 blocks away from where we start the tour. I didn't tell her anything about it, but I invited her to, drive by if you want, take a look at it. Just tell me if you get any kind of overwhelming sense of something related to that place.
I wonder if there's any, it's like what you're talking about too. It's like residue. If there was a UFO or a UAP or something showing up, if they didn't leave something physical behind, what could you measure to see that there's been something there that's like anomalous?
Yeah, well, totally. I don't think I'm betraying any confidence. I think Frank Kimbler has suggested this. Frank Kimbler, the researcher, has been out to the debris field site many times and found stuff. And like it was last summer, Chuck Zukowski, and L.A. Marzulli were out in the debris field. They're doing a little a film shoot for a DVD that L.A. was putting together. And all of a sudden, their cameras simultaneously died. They had 2 cameramen. All of a sudden, the the drone refused to fly. They pull out an EMF meter, and sure enough, there's something pinging hot. And so they pull out the metal detector, and lo and behold, there's some strange metal. And as Frank talks about it, he's like, the idea is, what if, and nobody's ever found the metal that has the memory metal properties, where you can crumple it up, and then it unfolds itself to its original shape. Nobody's ever found the metal that is, as Jesse Marcel said, no thicker than the foil off a pack of cigarettes, yet you can't dent it with a sledgehammer. Nobody's ever found that. Well, maybe the reason why is because for that material to have those extraordinary properties, it has to be energized in some way. And after some sort of mishap, crash, the material is deposited on the surface of our planet. That energy bleeds out. It dissipates over time so that those extraordinary properties recede. And tie that in now with the claims of the Brazel family and ranch hands out there, which is that the sheep refused to cross that piece of land where the debris fell with all of those extraordinary properties for 3 years afterwards. So that energy, whatever it is, infuses itself into the land. The material itself loses some of that property as the energy bleeds out into the land, but the animals sense it. So it's right up that alley of what you're talking about, Astral.
What would be the characteristics of if something was found that would make it extraterrestrial or alien in itself? Like what would have to be done to it?
Well, I'm probably not the best person to answer that, but when you look at most of the testing that gets done, first of all, you're analyzing its basic components, its elemental composition, determine if it matches any known man-made alloys. But then the next thing to do is to try to do some sort of isotopic ratio test. Believe it or not, my master's degree was largely focused on metallurgy, but I've done not a bloomin' thing with it in the last 20 plus years since I got that degree. So I don't really speak that language very natively off the top of my head. But apparently there's, isotopes that they are not found on Earth. They are indicative of it coming from a different planet. But kind of along those lines, let me veer into a different kind of topic that really strikes me as I go through the witness testimony. In 1978, when Major Marcel first talks to Stan Friedman, and then he talks to a couple of other researchers, and then in 1979, Stan Friedman and Bill Moore really start doing the real investigation into the Roswell case. They locate all these other witnesses. They go out into the Lincoln County ranch lands, talk to the neighbors of Mac Brazel, people who knew Mac Brazel, people who had handled the material. And common to all of those descriptions of the material is a very sort of, I think, blasé. It's just on the edge of normal human experience, but yet weird enough that it sticks in their mind. And when this testimony is first being collected, this is in the time frame that Close Encounters of the Third Kind has just come out, where alien space vehicles are just blinding lights and they maneuver in strange ways. Star Wars has come out, where you literally have, and I will mangle the term, laser swords, energy projecting forward and able to do incredible damage. You've had over a decade since Star Trek was out there, which with all of its amazing looking things and technology. And the witnesses involved in the Roswell incident are not telling you stories of strange metal that glows, that levitates, that controls your mind, that has all kinds of extraordinary properties. They're telling you of something that is perceptible and conceivable to the human mind, although it veers, it's just slightly beyond what's explainable. And so what that observation, for me, it cuts two ways. On the one hand, it lends itself to the naysayers who are like, yeah, it really was just a bunch of pile of tinfoil trash from a weather balloon system. That it's just slightly exaggerated in their memory. But on the other hand, what it does is it says there's nothing in their descriptions that defies their credibility as witnesses. They are describing tangible things, not the stuff of fantasy and ridiculous imagination. They're describing things that we can imagine. If an actual physical structure from another world landed on this planet, we would be able to handle it, touch it. It would leave gouges in the earth, and it would leave pieces of debris, and we'd be able to perceive it and interact with it. And so to me, that goes towards their credibility as not people who are inventing crazy tales. Yeah, go ahead, Astral.
No, I was just going to add to, when I came to Roswell last year, the most powerful thing to me when I was looking at a lot of the Roswell, story, was going to the museum and seeing how many people were actually involved. So it wasn't exactly one person's interpretation of what happened during Roswell, but the totality of all the people that were involved, the whole community that was involved in something that was happening, and not taking somebody's exact story for it and saying, like, there was definitely something there, but the exact thing is yet to be kind of determined.
Yeah, there's such a huge number of people who have things to say about it. And of course, the naysayers will go into the lore of how modern myths are generated, and they'll do all this psychosocial stuff, saying it's people jumping on the bandwagon. But then you have a witness out of nowhere who I haven't done my due diligence on this guy to confirm everything about his story. But it was reported by a MUFON researcher 30 years ago, a researcher by the name of Joseph Stefula. And Joseph Stefula at the time had given up on Roswell as an actual alien crash. So, but he was kind of, as I understand it, sort of doing favors for other folks in the MUFON community, and decided to go ahead and help out and call an old veteran of the 509th Bomb Group who was here in Roswell in 1947. That guy's name was Chester Barton. Chester Barton, according to Stefula, had no idea, this is in the early mid-1990s, Chester Barton had no idea that the event that he was involved in, the Roswell crash of whatever it was, had become a big pop culture phenomenon. He had no idea. He had no idea there were books written about it. There was research that had gone on, TV shows that were out. He had no idea. He's an old man in his 80s. He's not paying attention to pop culture. And so when contacted by Stefula, he's like, wow, how do you know about this? And so then the interview unfolds. And Stefula, being, I think he was a former police investigator, he has some good techniques that he describes. He had just kind of a preliminary call, got some data, and then called him back a second time, arranged a second time for like an in-depth interview. And when Stefula quizzes this old man, not quizzes, he reintroduces himself in the second interview and deliberately seeds his opening discussion with some falsehoods. Boom. Right away, old Chester Barton says, no, I didn't say that. It was this, right? So in other words, his mind was sharp, right? He was paying attention, and his memory was solid and didn't change from one time to the next. So here's what Chester Barton had to say. He was not persuaded that it was a UFO. He was not persuaded that it was something extraterrestrial, but neither was he persuaded that it was a weather balloon. He had personally been to the debris field, or I should say, one of the recovery sites of crash material, somewhere very close, north of town, so not the Brazel debris field, somewhere much closer. He had personally gone out there at the on the orders of the base provost marshal, Edwin Easley. He's sent out there as a sort of the provost marshal's right-hand man. Go take a look, make sure the thing, make sure recovery operations are going smoothly. Come back, give me a verbal report. And Chester Barton, when he's out there at the crash site, he observes a huge quantity of silver metallic debris. When he's interviewed half a century later by Joseph Stefula, he says, I assume it was one of our B-29s that had a crash. But why did he assume that? Well, because it's all this silver metal. But when quizzed, he could not identify any recognizable piece of a man-made craft. There was no landing gear. There was no window frames. There was no control surfaces. There was no tailpiece, which often survives a crash. There was no big chunks of engine, piston-driven engines that would have survived a crash. There was nothing recognizable to it. So he assumed for half a century that it must have been one of their own craft that had a mishap. He was not persuaded, but he hadn't really given it any thought. He'd heard the story of a flying saucer, but all he knew, he did not get close enough to it. He was told not to. Just go take a look at the scene. And he sees all this metallic debris at a crash site, and the one thing that he knows absolutely 100% for certain that he insists upon more than once with Joseph Stefula is that craft, whatever it was, it had a crew. That is amazing. I went off on that tangent telling that story because, Astral, you mentioned how there's so many people who tell stories. And the ones that really stick out to me as incredibly potent and powerful are the ones where they seem to be disconnected from all the other lore. They're not people who are living in town together and maybe could have been trading stories and rumors and inflating them over the decades. This guy lives far, far away. And he's never talked about it. I mean, this is in the 90s. He had never talked about it, never talked to
High strangeness.
Yeah. But there's what makes the Roswell story really pop as a researcher when you're digging into it is when you realize here are two data points that never would have had an opportunity to contaminate each other. Two pieces of this story, two witnesses that are never realistically going to have any opportunity to compare notes and get on the same page, and boom, they say the same thing. That is the kind of stuff that's absolutely amazing.
It indeed is, and I think this is a good time for me to say this is Dr. Mounts from All Things Unexplained, and I want to thank Astral for inviting us to host our first ever UFO Twitter Week space. This is All Things Roswell. Astral, thank you so much. We really appreciate the invitation to do this, and we decided to pick one of our favorite topics, Roswell, because you know what? I think it's fair to say UFO Twitter Week may not even exist if it hadn't been for the Roswell incident. I want to welcome somebody to the room tonight that is kind of a stranger to UFO Twitter, but she's in here with us, Unexplained CJ, my loyal co-host. CJ, welcome to the room.
Oh, thank you for having me. I am such a newbie. I hope I'm doing this right. I'm not even sure if you can hear me because, well, this is my first time on here, but if you can hear me, thank you, Astral, for having us. And Paul, thank you for sharing all of your knowledge. It's so interesting.
Well, hey, CJ, we have never had a chance to meet, even electronically, although I got some text messages that I think you were copied on. So it's nice to finally meet you in some way. I've heard you on many podcasts.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to meet you too. And yes, I'm sorry I am late. I am failing in all ways this evening, but I am happy to be here now.
Well, I want to welcome my friend Paul from the Roswell UFO tour. He was kind enough to join us, and he's the most knowledgeable expert that I know of when it comes to Roswell. CJ and I like to say that, we're not particularly experts on any of the UFO topics, but we love to talk to people that are experts, and Paul is just such an example. And before I forget, for everybody in the space tonight, Paul actually has a little something for them in connection with the UFO tour.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Dr. Mounts, you are too kind. I am always hesitant to consider myself an expert in anything. The more you dig into something, the more you realize here is someone else who knows more than you do. But I'm happy to call myself a specialist in the Roswell case because that's what I'm doing almost every day, telling people about it. But yeah, so anybody who's here listening, if you would like to join me and various other people on a tour of the town of Roswell and venturing out into the neighborhood, seeing historic homes, venturing down to the base, then if I've got tickets currently on sale now through November, and of course we'll be getting more tickets on sale in the future as well. But if you want to buy a ticket, then send an email to me, the address that's at the website, and I will make sure that you get an absolutely free $15 value Spaceport Roswell virtual reality experience, one of our partner attractions.
I'm wondering, for the unexplained and all things, what you guys think is the most important thing that's going to be going forward, or do you think there's a shift happening? Because if you look at Arrow, the UAP Disclosure Act, there's a little bit of frustration there with how there's been the traditional way of going forward, and there's like a shift maybe happening. Do you see as like an alternate way of people are going to find out about the UFO topic?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this the other night, and I'll go ahead and tackle this, and then CJ might have some thoughts. I think there's really two trains of thought here on this. That we're going to have some people in the UFO community who sit back and wait for answers from somebody else, but then you're going to have other people like my guest Paul from the Roswell UFO tour, and Toby, who was in here, I think, from, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, the Daily Roswell.
The
Roswell Daily
Roswell
Record.
Daily Record.
Roswell Daily Record. Whoops, sorry, Toby. But they are two brilliant researchers, and they're not just sitting back and waiting for Arrow or the government or legislators to pass some sort of legislation to tell them what to think or what's out there, right? Like they're literally doing the research on their own. They're hitting the field, like they're going out in the desert with metal detectors, and they're getting their hands dirty, and they're going after the truth their own selves. And I think that's where the ticket lies. That's where the next wave lies. I don't wait on the government to tell you what's out there, what to think. Are you really going to believe it, even if they do disclose something? I think we're all powerful in our own ways, and we can all research. We can all get off our phones for a little while and get out there and get our own hands dirty instead of waiting on somebody else to tell us. What do you think, CJ?
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with that. I think that the government has been covering things up for decades now, and any information that they are releasing is probably just a distraction from the truth. I do not anticipate that we are going to get disclosure from the government in any real way in the next decade, even. And I do think that our best chance of learning anything is from each other. It's through these spaces, it's through people sharing their experiences, it's through all of the footage that people are now starting to catch on their phones and on their Ring cameras and things such as that it's really going to come from this community of people who wants to know more, who are doing the research, who have got boots on the ground and sharing with one another.
Hey, let me
Yeah,
touch on
absolutely.
that because Arrow put out their report back in March. And of course, I downloaded and immediately jumped to the Roswell section. And I'm like, wait, there's like 3 paragraphs here. You realize everybody talks about that Arrow report being 60 some pages. No, it's not. Strip out the useless references in the back, most of which give you no information at all, other than that one of their primary sources was a Wikipedia fan page. Strip out, the table of contents up front and all the cover page, and you're left with 40 pages of actual text. I wrote 10 times as much maybe not 10 times as much, but master's thesis is far more than that. And that was just me, one person with less time than they had to generate this, with a huge staff and millions of dollars. And what did they do in the Roswell section? Oh, by the way, they're mandated by Congress to put forward a historical report surveying the entire history of the government involvement in the UFO phenomenon, and how much does that history last, at least until you get to kind of like the Skinwalker Ranch era, 50, 60 years of UFO history. It lasts less than 9 pages. That's the page count of what they devoted to a congressional mandate. They are staffed, they are funded to go forth, dig through the history of the UFO phenomena, and they give us 9 pages. I was a college professor for a while. That's an F. That's not only an F, that's a middle finger to the assignment. But when they get to Roswell, I was blown away. I was blown away that they trot out this hoary old excuse, this amazing, this thing that's supposed to be so amazing, which is that in 1994, the Secretary of the Air Force signed a proclamation saying that everything about Roswell was now declassified. If you were part of the event, you could now talk about it. Well, guess what? Nobody who was a part of the event was a member of the United States Air Force, because the United States Air Force didn't exist in July of 1947. And secondly, when the men under Colonel Richard Weaver, First Lieutenant James McAndrew, and their associates, and God bless them, I think they did the task that they had set before them to the best of their ability. But when they do this investigation, they only bothered to interview one man who had ever served in Roswell and was part of the events. How is that any kind of investigation? And how can our Department of Defense, Arrow, today, this year, the 30th anniversary of that Roswell investigation, come out and say that, yeah, it looked pretty good to us? They had everything declassified. They did interviews, and they found the solution. They interviewed.
It was a lazy front, and I think the way that they were waiting for people to come forward of the whistleblowers, and that there was no to me, when I visited Roswell last year, the most powerful thing was going to the museum and seeing in town how many people were actually involved in the whole Roswell event, from citizens to people driving the cars to all of that.
Yeah, lot people involved from at every level of whether they were ranchers way out in the land or townspeople in the heart of town or working down on the base. And many of them were still alive in 1994 when that investigation began, when the Air Force had to do their investigation. But as you read, and I'd recommend anyone interested in the Roswell case, read Colonel Richard Weaver's book. You can get it on Amazon. He published it about 4 years ago. It's called Roswell Backstory. And he talks about how before the official tasking came to them to investigate Roswell, they already had their likely answer. They already knew there was this thing called Project Mogul, and they figured that would be the explanation. And so the 1994 Roswell report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, that's misnamed. It's the Mogul report. It's nearly 1,000 pages, actually nearly 900 pages of research on Project Mogul. And then they took that and they said, how can we make this explain Roswell? That's not how you investigate a case. And here's the thing that really gets me. This is in one of the pages of the 1994 report, the minutia, the attachments that people pay no attention to. There was one of the government entities that was tasked with searching all of their records for anything related to Roswell and the like in the time frame of interest. The time frame they don't quite get right, but anyway, regardless, to look at anything in their records. And what are their search terms? Two of their search terms were, quote, UFOs and, quote, unidentified flying objects. Those terms didn't exist in 1947. You know what terms were missing from their document research? Flying discs and flying saucers. Those were the terms in use in 1947. The incompetence is ridiculous. And get this too. I think I have this right. This is from memory. The time span that they wanted to research documents on didn't actually include, I think it didn't include the dawn of the flying saucer wave with Kenneth Arnold in June of 47. It didn't include the beginning of Project Mogul. So they didn't start early enough to try to cover all their bases. It was just, you look at things like that, and that's how a government investigation proceeds when there is no advocate on the inside for a more non-traditional explanation, who knows something about the shape of the case and can say, guys, you're not even looking in the right place. They had no one like that, unless maybe it was Carl Flock, who, of course, became a big debunker. He did great work. His book is well worth reading, but he was somehow behind the scenes involved with getting that Project Mogul explanation put forward. And so that's all they did in 1994. They did a Project Mogul investigation, slapped the name Roswell on it, called it a day. And then 30 years later, Arrow this year says, Air Force investigation, we give it a thumbs up.
Well, to honor the history of Roswell and to make up for the travesty that was the Arrow report, Paul, would you mind taking all of us back to 1947? And there definitely may be some people that are not 100% sure exactly what happened.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, and one way I really like to look at the case is just to look at the open source information that's out there. Instead of diving into the minutia of all the witnesses who said this and said that, and then you're trying to untangle a Gordian knot of how exactly those witness testimonies can fit together and what day this happened and what day that happened and which thing happened first. Just go right back to the beginning. Look at the newspaper articles. This is an event where indisputably something is found, not in Roswell, but approximately 60-mile straight line distance northwest of Roswell. It's found by some folks out there in the middle of nowhere who make their living. Material is brought to the town of Roswell. The military finds that whatever this is extraordinary enough that they will personally send their top 2 intelligence officers at the world's only nuclear-capable strike base on a day-and-a-half journey out into the middle of nowhere to go follow this rancher and pick up what he found. You don't do that if it's just some dusty old guy in a dirty old cowboy hat showing up telling tales of strange tinfoil. You send a couple of corporals maybe out there to do the courtesy of help him clean up his land. No, instead, indisputably, agreed upon by the government, the top 2 staff intelligence officers personally go out to investigate. They bring material back. We will argue all day long about what that material was. Was it a piece of a flying saucer? Was it a piece of a weather balloon? The bottom line is they brought material back. And before the press release is even sent out to the world, they have treated it with enough seriousness that it is now being couriered by Major Jesse Marcel himself, the staff intelligence officer of the world's only nuclear-capable strike group, to higher headquarters. He is carrying it to General Roger Ramey, 8th Air Force Headquarters Commander in Fort Worth, Texas. Then the press release hits the news wires. So it's already in motion, being treated with a high degree of seriousness. The seriousness does not arrive because people are making a hoopla and it's going crazy on the news, and top, generals are like, wait a minute, bring that to me. Let's get this straightened out. No, they are already treating it with a high degree of seriousness under orders, taking it to higher headquarters. Then the press release goes out and the world gets a glimpse of it. We could argue all day long about why does the press release get sent out. Is the press release in fact true, or is it some kind of its own, in some ways, a bit of disinformation, sort of distracting people? I think there's a lot of disinformation and distraction in the press release. For one thing, it says, we recovered it, we've got it, now it's gone, it's being shipped away. Well, they didn't recover it, they recovered a piece of it. But to make it sound like the case was closed and the matter was done and everything has been collected and shipped off, that shuts down the rumors and shuts down the looky-loos wanting to go out, hopefully, in the military's perspective, hopefully shuts that down, people going and interfering with the crash site and learning more than they should. So I think there's some deliberate disinformation in the press release, any way you look at it. And anyway, it gets taken to Fort Worth Army Airfield, and that very same day, General Ramey declares it to be all a bunch of hot air. It was just a weather balloon with a tinfoil radar target kite, one singular kite hanging below one singular balloon. It was all just a case of mistaken identity, and the story is shut down on that very same day. Don't believe the cable TV shows and some of the lousy books by people who are, well, maybe decent enough books, but they're not specialists in the Roswell case. Don't believe the hoary old line, which is that Roswell is a case where the military announced they had a flying saucer, and then the next day they changed the story. I wish they wait till the next day to change the story. You know what would have happened if they had? Local newsmen in Roswell would have done some poking around. Local newsmen who are literal neighbors, in some cases possibly next door neighbors with senior officers down on the base, they would have started asking questions and realized that the story they're being given is not the whole story. They would have done some investigative journalism and started to break the story open. That didn't happen because they didn't change the story the next day. They changed the story within a matter of hours. In my opinion, I favor this theory of the case, which is that there's rumors going around town already, and the military decides the best way to shut down those rumors is just to lean into them. Go ahead and admit it. We caught a flying saucer. You folks are right. We've got it taken care of. We've got it all gathered up. Now stand by for more details. And a few hours later, the details come out, and it's pictures of a weather balloon on the floor. Here's something very important. If people have not paid close attention to the fine details of Roswell, if they've listened to such erroneous things as, I'm going to say it, Danny Sheehan goes on the Danny Jones podcast a few months ago and trots out a complete line of absolute factual garbage about these photos, by the way. The photos make it onto the front pages, photos of Major Marcel and General Ramey and his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas Jefferson DuBose, holding pieces of the flying saucer, allegedly. It's a bunch of tinfoil trash. Those are taken not in Roswell. They're taken in Fort Worth, Texas. Those pictures are taken not even in the same state where the events occur. And think about it this way. If the O.J. Simpson trial had only one single piece of evidence for the prosecution, imagine that their only piece of evidence was the glove. But not the glove itself, pictures of the glove. And not pictures of the glove at the scene, pictures of the glove taken in somewhere like Florida. Would you convict O.J. Simpson? Would you believe that the prosecution is putting on a real case? No. You'd laugh it out of court. What we have in the Roswell case, the only agreed upon forensic evidence in the case, are the 4 surviving negatives of the pictures of the tinfoil trash taken in General Ramey's office in Texas. They are physically held to this very day at the University of Texas at Arlington Archives. 4 surviving negatives, which we can see now in glorious high digital resolution. Those pictures are supposed to be the full explanation of the whole story. They're not even from the same state where the events occurred. So what you have is a whole chain of custody. We're supposed to believe it was Project Mogul flight number 4. All right? We're supposed to believe that the stuff you see in those pictures, that's all it was. That's the full explanation of the entire Roswell case. Well, guess what? You have to complete a chain of custody for that to be true. You have to demonstrate that a toy company in New York City made these tinfoil radar targets, complete with Scotch tape that had flowers printed on it. Those tinfoil radar targets were delivered to a team from the New York University, which is working for the Army Air Forces on this balloon project. Those tinfoil radar targets have to be carried with all their test equipment to Alamogordo Army Airfield in New Mexico. Those tinfoil radar targets then have to be assembled onto a balloon that gets launched and then happens to land on Brazel's land. It then has to get picked up by Major Marcel, taken to his house in the middle of the night, then taken down to the base, then loaded on board an aircraft, and then flown to Texas, and then we get our first photographs of the things. There is not one document, not one photo that connects any one of those links in that chain of custody. And yet we're just supposed to roll over and believe that the pictures in General Ramey's office of Major Marcel posed with some tinfoil trash, that explains the whole story. Well, let me ask you this. We are expected to believe that the pristine, beautiful, shiny tinfoil in those pictures is the very material that laid out on Mac Brazel's desert-like ranch land in the monsoon season of Lincoln County, New Mexico, with its windstorms, rainstorms, hailstorms, flash flooding, dirt that clings to boots and metallic surfaces with a static cling like powdered sugar. You can barely get it off. You just spread it around. In a land of wild antelope, free-range cattle that leave cow patties every 10 feet through the land. And it laid out there, according to our government, for anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks before the pictures are taken. Look in those pictures. Where's the dirt?
That's a great point.
So I have a question, if that's okay.
Hey, you're a co-host, CJ. It's all okay.
So, thinking back on Roswell, this happened over, 77 years ago now? So people that were involved at the time, let's say they were 20 years old, they're now in their late 90s. So most of those involved in this have passed on. What risk do we run now that the truth of Roswell has died with the people that knew the secrets?
I mean, that's a problem. That's a problem. But it is a problem that historians have faced since the word history was invented, right? There are documents we can hope to find. There are photographs that we could hope to find. I have to believe that somewhere in the chain of custody of whatever real material was recovered, pictures were taken. There is compelling testimony of photographers who were taken out there to the site. Those pictures have to exist somewhere. They weren't burned. I can't imagine. There's no reason, no matter what the thing was, for that material to be destroyed. Lost, perhaps, yes. But now think about this too. As I said, the only forensic evidence that we can all agree upon that exists in the case are the 4 negatives that still survive of the pictures taken in General Ramey's office. Here in the Historical Society of Southeast New Mexico, there are 10 photo volumes. Each photo, a black and white print with the photographer's handwritten notes next to it, giving you its originator's notations on the date and the location. 10 giant volumes that, as far as I know, to this day still have never been scanned in, digitized, fully cataloged. A number of those photos I use in the tour, and I show people things that have never been published before, as far as I know. Imagine what might be in those photos if you could find, for example, a picture that the photographer is walking down the street. He snapped a shot of, the storefront of a restaurant or whatever. And there in the background is an army jeep, and there's a guy in uniform, and he's carrying a box, and you can kind of make out something shiny sticking out of the box. And you do your forensic analysis of the photo, and you realize exactly where that is exactly where some chapter in the Roswell story says an Army officer carried material. Imagine if we could find something like that. It could be lurking in someone's box of old photos, and no one's ever found it. And it just has something in the background that could unlock a piece of the case, that could confirm the broad strokes of the story as we have it. And so yes, most of the witnesses are dead. I can tell you from my own experience, not all of them, although I'm not aware of any witnesses who have anything really earth-shaking that they recall, but they can provide us context. They can give us a sense of what the time was like and what was going on. They're not all dead. Most of them are, but a few are still alive. And but we have other sources too, and it's just they're going to be hiding somewhere. Who knows where these pictures might be hiding? A picture that no one even realizes is important until an expert or a specialist in the story has a chance to look at it and realize what's going on. So there's still avenues. There's still things to pursue. And that's my holy grail, right? People talk about and people will talk about the holy grail of the Roswell case would be a piece of memory metal. That would be absolutely amazing. I've handled some strange metal that's been pulled out of the dirt at the Brazel debris field. It's an amazing experience, and you just wonder, what is this that you've got in your hands? But for me, the holy grail is Grandma's diary. I just want to find that piece of paper, that document from the time. It claims to be from the time. You can test it, and it's consistent with the paper and the ink from the time. And there it is, plain language right there. We had to close the store today because of a, quote, military parade running down Main Street, end quote. It's their little code word for whatever it was that was going on, is a convoy of material rolled down Main Street. That's the kind of thing I can hope to find. I'm not saying such a thing exists, but I hope it does. And for me, that would be the holy grail, to find something like that. So yeah, the witnesses are mostly gone, but we have other avenues and other areas to hope.
And I think, Paul, you just really laid out exactly what CJ and I were talking about when we were answering Astral. What do we see as the next steps? But you really laid out why, hey, if you're waiting on the government for disclosure, I mean, just take a look at what was going on in 1947, and the same sort of things are still going on. And it kind of makes you realize or think, like, maybe that's not the smartest thing to wait on the government for disclosure. One thing Astral brought up that struck him when he visited the UFO museum in Roswell was just how much this affected the town. And I've got a list here of it's like a movie script, Paul, of all the people, all the townspeople and military people involved in this. One of them that really fascinates me has always been this local mortician, Glenn Dennis. What can you tell us about Glenn Dennis?
Well, I can tell you it's my least favorite part of the story to talk about, because I never had a chance to meet him. I have to say that. I never had a chance to meet him. But those who did, the men who spent decades since I was in elementary school, really, studying this case, I think to a man, every one of them has said they just don't trust his story. I'll put it that way. Let's say, as people try to reconstruct the events of the Roswell incident,
What was his
falling
story?
out of favor.
Paul, what?
Go ahead, Tim. You kind of broke up. I was stepping on you. What?
Yeah, what exactly was he saying, Paul?
Well, okay, so he comes out. His first interview is with Stanton Friedman in August of 1989. Now, there had been some rumors going around that there was some sort of mortician, a mortician who was involved in some way with the case. Kevin Randall talks about how the clue that he had was that apparently this is a mortician who'd worked at the library in Albuquerque. So Kevin Randall talks about how he goes and he hangs out at the library and tries to figure out if there's any connection, talks to people, and gets nowhere with it. And then Walter Haught, the public information officer, who lived in Roswell his entire life after the event, he says, "Yeah, you're looking for Glenn Dennis." And so there's two threads pursuing Glenn Dennis, two threads of investigation: Stan Friedman and Kevin Randall. And I think Don Schmidt was involved on the angle that Randall was pursuing, because they were writing partners at the time. By the way, hang on, let me make a plug, because October 2nd, Netflix Unsolved Mysteries, there will be a new episode on Roswell. Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt together again back here in Roswell. They filmed the episode last summer. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they actually put together. That's going to be cool. But anyway, so the mortician, he's found in August of 1989. It's the first interview with Stan Friedman. He was a known quantity to some of the other folks who were interested in the Roswell case, living here in Roswell in the late 80s. And Glenn Dennis tells the story of how he was sitting at the funeral home. He starts getting strange phone calls from the Air Force Base. They wanted to know how many child-sized coffins he's got in stock. They want to know his advice on how to preserve biological tissue that was laying out rotting in the desert sun, how, so as not to contaminate it or alter its chemistry, stuff like that. And then, of course, he tells the story of how he ends up going down to the base because Ballard Funeral Home ran an ambulance service. This is an important nugget to the story for my research. They ran an ambulance service. We know that's true. We can see the Ballard Ambulance Service advertisements in the Roswell Daily Record on the very same week as the Roswell incident. So we know that's true. And he ends up picking up some soldier. He gets himself injured. He goes down to the base. He walks into the base hospital emergency room wing to get the guy taken care of. And there's all this commotion. And to make a long story short, he's basically stumbled into what I would describe as the traumatic aftermath of an alien body examination. And he runs into this nurse who he knows. She's like, oh my gosh, you got to get out of here. Sure enough, he gets manhandled off the premises. He's in trouble with the base. That story comes from other angles as well. The sheriff learns that Glenn Dennis is in trouble for whatever he stumbled into, and goes and talks to Glenn Dennis's father and says, look, you better get your boy out of trouble. Tell him to keep quiet. But, a day or so after these events, the nurse wants to meet with Glenn Dennis and draw a picture for, tell him about the bodies that she saw, and she allegedly draws a picture for him. And then he never sees her again, and there's all this mystery about who was she really and what was her real fate. Glenn Dennis, and the reason why I say this is my least favorite part of the story is because he became one of the founders of the UFO Museum here. I hate to be the one advertising to the world that the researchers who knew him and studied the case think he was making up a lot of it. Not a trustworthy witness. He couldn't ever produce the real drawing. He instead created a facsimile of it based on his memory. He changed the name of the nurse. He gave like 3 different names for her, at least when you count different spellings. And there's all this mystery and all this confusion. And when you look at, I just recently read John Price's book. John Price, I think unsung hero of Roswell investigation. He ran the first actual museum that was opened in the town of Roswell. Spent his whole life here in Roswell, most of it anyway, other than work assignments. He grew up here. He has generational connections here, a father, grandfather. He knew Glenn Dennis. He knew Glenn Dennis's brother as well. And he knew Glenn Dennis before the story came out. And he talks about how there were problems with the story, and he suspected that Glenn was sort of adopting someone else's story and making up details for whatever reason to tell someone else's story. And there were all sorts of problems. Glenn Dennis, more than one researcher has said in print and to my face that Glenn Dennis would stand at the back end of the old hospital on the base in the early 1990s saying this is where everything happened. And the problem is the hospital that stood there was not built until 1960. It's not the real place. Now, is there some possibility maybe he claimed that some portion of the old hospital got built over and incorporated into the new one? I don't know. Maybe so. It just defied credibility. And the fact that his nurse, no one could ever find any proof of such a woman with such a name. He gave first, middle, and last name. He even gave a couple of different versions of the last name, and there's not a trace of such a woman who had served here in Roswell. But we know, here's the thing, we know that Glenn Dennis knew real things about real people and real events that happened on the base. There's a real possibility that he's getting certain people and certain events confused with the 1947 time frame, piling them all up as, kind of compressing some of his memory together. That's a possibility. But he knew real things. So it makes me realize there's a nugget of truth somewhere in his story. What is it? I don't know. But the idea of him going into the base, stumbling into this, the commotion, the nurse, it seems like it might be sort of an allegory of some other true event. But here's the thing. I don't know where the grain of truth is in his story, but I know I keep coming across people whose stories have not been fully told, whose names, they don't want their names out there. But they can corroborate in small ways the overall gist of his story. And one story that I heard had the absolute ring of truth from the witnesses who talked to me about this, is that apparently ambulances from the funeral home came rushing onto the base, interrupted some classified work, and whatever they were carrying needed the secure confines of the big hangar. I've never heard that piece of the story told. It comes from an untapped witness who I talked to them afterwards. They don't want their names out there. They don't want to be part of the hoopla. And so it's a whisper of a clue, and I'll tuck it away and talk about it a little bit, but maybe one day I'll find that other clue that corroborates it, and then we really know we have something.
Yeah, I just think it's so fascinating that I grew up in a small town, and so it's kind of like when the police used to have roadblocks set up, and maybe you get stopped at the roadblock, but the thing is, whoever the policeman was, they either knew you or they knew somebody akin to you, or they went to church with you or that sort of thing, right? So it was always a very interesting dynamic, and it always is with small towns, right? So when you're talking about somebody like Glenn Dennis, it just makes sense that there are grains of truth in there, right? Because this is somebody in the town running a business. He needs the trust of the other people in the community, as a professional person in the town, somebody that maybe goes to church with the other people, but sees the other people at the diner, that sort of thing. It's just really intriguing to me. Like, Paul, you've been there for a while now. I mean, how would you characterize what the incident did to the town itself and the people?
Well, I mean, to be clear, I did not grow up here. I am a latecomer, but I'm all in. This is where I live, and I care about the place, and I've cared about the place and its people since long before I cared deeply about researching the Roswell case. My first opportunity to be here was 26 years ago. I came here as a college student on a spring break trip and had a chance to meet Walter Haut and get his autograph. That was kind of cool. I was basically just an X-Files fan, though. Roswell was a cool place with a mystique to it. But I've always cared about the place. I've had longtime friends here and come back a number of times over the years for weddings and other creative enterprises. And the people I know closest, who I've known the longest, think the whole story's garbage. Honestly, I think probably a majority of people in the town today don't really give it any credence. I mean, maybe there's sort of an undertone that something happened and the government lied to us, but that's as far as it goes. People aren't devoting their lives to it, trying to answer the question. I think for the most part, if you had a family connection to the events and to the more traumatic aspects of the events, then probably it sticks with you and it's carried down through your family. If your family didn't, the effect of it disappeared. And there's much bigger, we have our lives to live. I forget who talks about in terms of, what happens after the aliens land for the first time, right? When the mothership finally lands on the White House lawn. Well, what happens? Well, the next day you still have to make breakfast for your kids. You still have to go to work. You got the trains and trucks have to keep running so the grocery stores stay full. And you have to you quickly adapt and you continue on with your life, and you have to keep your life going. And the Roswell event, you got to realize that in 1947, the men on the base at Roswell Army Airfield had a lot more important things to worry about than strange metal falling out of the sky. Their job was to be the world's only nuclear capable strike group. They had the job of delivering the atomic bomb if called upon. They're the only ones who can. And in 1947, they are a green outfit. They have a massive number of new people here. They have only just 4 months prior to the Roswell incident achieved full operational strength on the base in terms of having a full bomb group with 3 bomb squadrons, all manned, equipped, and ready to fly. They are a green outfit. They have been rapidly trying to get up to strength, and they have only achieved that. And they achieved it late. They missed their deadline, but they have only achieved it in the last 4 months. And then all of a sudden, this thing falls out of the sky, and they're in a tizzy, and they got to do stuff. But guess what? Only a year after the incident, actually 11 months after the Roswell incident, the Soviets are going to shut off Western Berlin. You're going to be on the cusp of World War III a year after the Roswell incident with the Berlin airlift crisis. And there's signals of the tension with the Soviets already going on and already seizing the military's, their priorities in 1947. And here's the world's only outfit that can actually deliver an atomic bomb if necessary. They can't afford to be distracted by this thing. They've got to get on about their business. And that's why I think everything gets cleaned up and shipped out real quick. And the town is going to be a reflection of that too. The entire physical scope of what we're dealing with in the Roswell incident is the amount of material that could be carried in one truck. The number of bodies involved could fit in one minivan. That's not going to affect, no matter how widely dispersed it is, no matter how many men have to be sent out to go make sure they've collected every scrap of it, no matter how many different times convoys of material have to come back in and out through town in the recovery operations, and how many flights have to fly out carrying it away, no matter how much of that's going on, this is still a town of 20,000 people covering scores of square miles. The vast, vast majority of people are not going to encounter it. And so I truly think that the vast majority of longtime residents here of Roswell, they're not going to have been immediately and personally impacted by it, but some will. And so, and the trauma of it fades with time. I mean, we just had the 23rd anniversary of 9/11. If you didn't lose somebody in the Twin Towers, the trauma of it has faded. But if you were part of one of the tens of thousands of people who had a family member or a close friend die on that day, it's going to mean a heck of a lot more to you. It means a lot to me. And I had no one close involved. I did know someone who lost an uncle, but that's, very remote. And so regardless, the trauma of a thing fades with time. And I can think of a guy I talked to here in Roswell. He actually did some work on our tour van. It got in a fender bender, and so he and I are in the vehicle together. He's shuttling me back to my car, or whatever it is. Once the van is picked up, and we're just chatting. And I just ask him, so what do you think happened here? And he kind of gives the same thing a lot of people say, which is, well, the universe is a big place. Well, yeah, sure, but that doesn't mean aliens crashed at Roswell. What do you think really happened here? And he's like, well, I mean, there's probably some cover up, but I don't put a lot of stock into the whole UFO thing. I can do without it. And then he's like, but of course, my father-in-law had a patient of his years ago who every time he'd come sit in the dentist's chair would talk about the strange material that he handled. So there it is. There's a guy, second or third generation away from the Roswell incident, who it's not a big deal to him, but yet there's a family connection still. If there was ever a trauma in that family or connected to someone that his family was connected to, it faded with time, to the point where 77 years, 3 generations later, for him, it was just kind of I could do without it kind of thing. I forget what the question was, but hey, if you wind me up, I'll get going and just talk. So.
No, I think you thoroughly covered the question pretty good there, Paul. That's just really great points you made there. And you brought up X-Files. And, it's really amazed me since CJ and I started doing the podcast, how many people we've talked to that have told us, X-Files really began their foray into exploring the unexplained or thinking more about the UFO phenomenon. And then we also had Unsolved Mysteries back in the day, right, with Robert Stack. And I'm pretty sure they did a Roswell episode back then that kind of reinvigorated the Roswell interest, right, the interest in the Roswell incident. So Roswell has really had a huge impact on popular culture and really the UFO culture as we know it today. And, Roswell really does play that up, right? So I have yet to be in attendance at the festival there, but I mean, certainly Roswell partakes in the culture that they've helped establish, right?
Yeah. But like I say, I think a lot of people in town could just do without it. That's just the reality. And people who come to town. Let me say this: I am in the rare and privileged position, surviving for now, where I walked away from a different career, an engineering career, investigating car crashes, paid a heck of a lot more money than I make now. But I made the decision for various reasons to walk away from that, come out here to Roswell a few years ago. And I am in the rare and privileged position of being one who basically my entire livelihood is dependent on the tourists of all stripes who come to town, no matter what they're interested in. And certainly not all of them are interested in the Roswell incident. There's a lot of other reasons for people on vacations to pass through Roswell and stop and look for something entertaining and positive and worthwhile to do. And so I'm in the position of offering that, and that's basically what I do full time in one capacity or another. That's a rare and privileged position, and there's not a lot of us here in town who do that. You might think it's different. People think that the town of Roswell, I see that all these debunkers talking about how Roswell, this huge grift running off the UFO thing, got to keep the ball rolling. Well, that's not what makes the town turn. That's not what makes this city continue in existence. It's not why it came into existence in the first place. It's not why it became an oasis in the desert a century ago. It's because of other qualities and other industries and people doing other things. It's not dominated by tourism, and it's certainly not dominated by the UFO tourism. It's a big piece, but it's not the majority of what makes the town turn. Tim, I see people have been raising their hands. You wanna allow?
Yeah, I don't see that. So if you can help me out with that, I actually don't see any hands
Oh,
raised for some
okay.
reason.
Actually, I want to speak. I will raise a hand. I can't raise a hand for some reason. But like I can still move my hand for some reason. And we are just blocked and loaded into that Bitcoin blockchain block.
What's your question, AI?
Gentlemen, should we send out more money for Roswell soon? More digital gold from the infinite storehouse? Wow.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't know anything
that
about
was,
digital gold and infinite storehouses. So, anybody else have a question?
you know, somebody did post something funny the other day on the show that it was something like, if what would aliens invest in on Earth? And I think they said not Bitcoin, but something like that. It was funny in the moment, but yeah. Are there any other questions out there? I'm actually not seeing the
Yeah, no,
hands.
I don't see any. I think somebody else had questions earlier, but no pending requests.
I will say this: if anybody wants to take a stab at some Roswell trivia, raise your hand. I've got some Roswell related products I can give away. Specifically, a friend of the show, Suzanne McDermott, who had a big hit called The Roswell Incident. She's a singer, and she had a big hit called The Roswell Incident. This song is 6 minutes and 47 seconds long, so it's quite the song. And on the same CD, I've got The Three Dreams of J. Robert Oppenheimer. So you've got some really surreal listening here if anybody wants to give it a shot. But Paul, I tell you one thing I wanted to bring up with you is how Roswell continues to reverberate even with modern UAP sightings. So I'm going to switch to the term UAP now a little bit here. But did you see where they obtained via FOIA request from the Canadian Department of Defense an image of this UFO that was shot down over the Yukon in February of 2023? But of course, has their military made this out to be but a weather balloon or a balloon of some sort? So 1947, it's a weather balloon. 2024, it's a weather balloon. It's still happening.
We saw a weather balloon during the tour yesterday afternoon. It was pretty amazing. And the weirdest thing about it was utterly stationary for hours. It was not a windy day, but there was some, and I am flabbergasted that this thing could be completely stationary for the entire duration of the tour. And one of the customers had been down at an RV site, and they'd seen it at like an hour before the tour as well. Big, white, had some weird, with the naked eye, certainly it seemed to kind of have some weird protuberances sticking out of it, but you could see it as that's probably just kind of where everything dangles down together. But it was weird. It is, here's the thing. As everyone who digs into the UFO question across its entire history, and speaks authoritatively on, as they will say, 95% of the cases are going to be explained. There's things in the air, and there's balloons. We still use balloons. In fact, you should look up sceye.com, I believe. It's a amazing, huge Goodyear blimp type looking thing, but apparently they don't call it a blimp. It uses some different technology. Well, that thing, this humongous, slick, silver, oblong football looking thing, is stationed here in Roswell at a giant inflatable hangar. And it is the most startling thing to see rising slowly up from the old Air Force Base. We have things like this. We have craft. We have balloons. It's natural that a certain percentage of things should be that. As for the Canadian sighting, that photo certainly catches the eye. I mean, it'll bear. You can compare it to the pictures of the Chinese spy balloon, where you've got you see the circular background shape of the balloon, and then its payload hanging below it. And you if you imagine that whatever photo they just released here yesterday is in really poor focus, it could be that. There's similarity. But then on the other hand, it's not impossible for widely divergent things to have a similar form factor and be something truly anomalous, even though it might look very similar to something that's familiar. I was just walking the dog some weeks ago, and it really jumped out at me. I marveled at this object that was laying there on the sidewalk as he walked past, and I had to bend down and look at it real close. I couldn't tell if it was an animal bone or a branch off a tree that had broken off. It was the weirdest thing, right? But just the fact that two widely disparate forms of life might have the exact same form factor in their death just kind of struck me as kind of an interesting object lesson, especially for the Roswell case. My overall theory of the case would suggest I favor this idea, right? Which is that something is found way out there in Lincoln County. Rumors of this are spreading through town. They seize upon the thing that is closest enough to it to explain it, at least to some rational observers, something that would be familiar to the people of Roswell. The Project Mogul balloon trains had already flown over the town of Roswell at the time all this happened. In fact, the very first successful flight, if you discount the rumored June 4th flight number 4, the very first successful flight, Mogul Flight 5, launched from Alamogordo on June 5th, 1947, headed straight for Roswell. And it lingered in the air for something like 30 minutes, just a few miles off the end of the runway. It's going to pose a flight hazard for all base operations. And then finally the air currents shift and it moves on, and it ends up coming to Earth some miles east of Roswell. It's picked up. There's no big hoopla about it. The men from the Project Mogul go out there and they pick it up and they bring it back. And apparently on that very same day, they are nearly running out of gas and they decide to stop at the front gate of Roswell Army Airfield, trying to get on the base to get a free tank of gas since they're on military orders. And apparently they even show off some of the material of Project Mogul to the guards at the front gate, and the guards turn them away. They say, nope, sorry, fellas, you're going to have to go buy your own gas up in town. With all that context, you want to tell me that the men of the Roswell Army Airfield, the intelligence officers whose number one job is to make sure that the men flying their missions can do so safely and accomplish their mission, you want to tell me that they're not aware that there's large-scale balloon projects being launched 100 miles to the west, which, without warning, could impinge on their flight operations by drifting into their flight paths? I think, of course, they have to know that Project Mogul exists. And then we're supposed to believe that suddenly, a month later, they can't recognize one when they see one out there on Brazil's land? No, in fact, my theory of the case is that when they find something extraordinary, they seize upon the closest reasonable thing that can explain it. And it might indeed have similar form factors, just the way a bone versus a tree branch might, a balloon versus a Chinese spy balloon seen from below versus some weird near circular object. There will be similar form factors, and they will use that to their advantage to shut the story down. And the only thing they needed to make the cover-up work was 2 tinfoil radar targets. One of them to throw in front of the rancher and get him to memorize the thing, and then give a description of it to the local paper. And then another one to fly along with Major Marcel and carry to Fort Worth, since apparently neither Roswell nor Fort Worth used tinfoil radar targets. Where does the thing come from that was in the pictures? It had to come from somewhere. Well, I agree. I think it probably came from Project Mogul. The men at Roswell executing a cover-up of the story, they know exactly where to find the object that they need to make the story go away, because they've already had Project Mogul flying through their airspace. Call over there, tell them, send us some of those things. Ship them, just fly them over here real quick. We need a couple. One of them turns out to be one of the ones manufactured by the toy company in New York City that used the that used the whatever Scotch tape they could find. Some of it had flowers printed on it. And then you get Mac Brazel sitting there in the newsroom of the Roswell Daily Record saying, yes, there was Scotch tape with flowers printed on it. He literally says that. And then the other one happened not to be manufactured by those folks. They fly it along with Major Marcel. Look in those pictures in General Ramey's floor. Can you find any Scotch tape that has flowers printed on it? No, you can't. So anyway, that's kind of my grand unified theory of how the case unfolds and how Project Mogul relates to it. It's taking advantage of similar form factors for disparate objects, and they know exactly where they need to go to get the stage props that are necessary to complete the cover-up.
I really want to thank my friend Paul from the Roswell UFO Tour for being so kind and generous of his time to jump in our Twitter space tonight for UFO Twitter Week. Paul has a special offer for anybody that wants to take the tour, and that is if you will purchase. Paul, can you actually take over from here so I don't jumble this all up?
Yeah. So if you get on our website, we have tour tickets available on sale from now through the end of November. I have not yet added December and 2025 tickets yet, but they're available right now through November. And if you get on the website, buy a ticket, then just send me an email. There's a email address right there on the website, roswellufotour.com. You'll find the email address that goes right to me. And if you say you heard this space and you've bought a ticket, I'll make sure you get a free chance to see our partner attraction, Spaceport Roswell, a virtual reality experience. A very fun, fictionalized version of the crash of 1947. You actually get to be on the UFO in a virtual reality setting and join them on the crash and see all the terrible, nefarious things that our government does to those poor visiting aliens after the fact. It's a lot of fun. It's a $15 value.
Can't beat that. Paul, what's the most unusual incident you ever had happen on a tour?
So this is great. This is great. We went driving down towards the base, and we're about a mile away from the front gate, and there's all this massive police presence, literally 50 or 60 state, county, and city vehicles surrounding a spot. They hadn't blocked off traffic, so we're able to drive literally right past a scene, which is a collection of storage sheds. There are snipers on the roof. There are men with guns drawn. They haven't stopped traffic. We just drive right through it. They're obviously in a standoff trying to get somebody. So we go. We're all astonished and startled. We go down. We do the portion of the tour that's on the base, and then we're headed back up towards town. And it turns out all the cop cars are gone now. We're like, something happened. But then we noticed that there was a gate in that space that has been like smashed out of place from inside. Apparently, the guy who was the fugitive had hotwired a car, or it was his own, whatever the case, and he floored it, blasted through a chain link gate, and went leading all these officers on a merry chase on the roads there on the south end of town. And then he swings right past us. His rear tires have already been shot out. We are stopped at a light. Police officers are blocking traffic at the intersection. And we look to our right, and we see this pickup truck with the fugitive, who we learned later had apparently shot 2 people. He's spinning out with no rubber on his rear wheels. He knocks over a road sign, and then he comes blasting through the intersection. He drives right past us, and his window's down, and his hand comes out the window. Aimed right at us, but he's just doing a V for victory sign with his fingers. This moment, with all the people I had in the van, this crazy event unfolding in front of us, not a one of us got a cell phone out and captured any video of the moment. Which shows you how, if the story is true, that a convoy of Army Jeeps and a tractor trailer with a strange object loaded on the back of the flatbed trailer, covered with a tarp, if it rolled right down Main Street, Roswell, in 1947, on its way to the base, nobody would have gotten a picture of it. It's entirely plausible that nobody got a picture of it. At least no citizens. Now, The only problem is sitting right there in the lobby of the Roswell Daily Record, exactly in front of the courthouse where the truck and trailer and strange object are going to drive by. There's an Associated Press wire service photographic specialist sitting there twiddling his thumbs, waiting for something to take pictures of. And he doesn't get it either. Anyway, that was the weirdest thing that happened on tour, and it serves as an excellent object lesson.
And, I think there's still hope, like you were saying earlier, Paul, that, maybe somebody did get a picture, and it's still out there somewhere waiting for somebody to get off their iPhones and go research and find it. And like we were saying earlier, all the more reason to not just sit back and wait on the government to disclose things. If Roswell proves anything, it is that, are we really going to believe what the government and military tells us is happening anyway? No, I think that we're going to believe more likely what we turn up and what we discover. So thanks again to Paul, who runs the UFO Roswell tour, for joining us tonight. I want to open up real quick. If anybody has any questions for Paul about Roswell or anything else, now is the time before we close out for the night. Paul, are there any closing thoughts you have for tonight?
We're supposed to believe that the pictures of Major Marcel posed with some tinfoil trash on the floor of General Ramey's office over in Texas explain the whole story. That's what we're supposed to believe. We're supposed to believe the stuff you're looking at in those photos laid out on Mac Brazel's ranch land in the monsoon season of the dusty, dirty Lincoln County, with windstorms, rainstorms, hailstorms, and flash flooding, for either 3 or 5 weeks, depending on which part of the preferred government explanation you believe. And as you look at those photos, ask yourself, where's the dirt? Perhaps the only photos that exist are the only photos we need to know that we were lied to then, and they continue to hide the truth to this very day. That is my closing thought.
That's good. And I see some speakers have jumped up. I just want to see if they had anything for you. UFO intros, Kimball, Indeed, Darius. Anybody have anything they want to ask Paul before we get out for the night?
Yeah, thanks, all things. I got on here late. I'm sorry I missed this, but I'm glad it's recorded. Paul, I just thought I would ask, what are 2 or 3 aspects of Roswell maybe that most people, even ufologists, may not know or may be surprised to hear?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there are some very important misconceptions that some very famous people continue, because they're not specialists in the case. They continue to spread these pieces of incorrect information. First of all, Roswell is not a case where the military told the truth that they captured a flying saucer and then the next day they changed the story. I wish it was the next day. If it had been the next day, the local newsmen could have done some investigative journalism. No, they changed the story on the same day. That's the first thing. Secondly, the pictures that we have, the only forensic evidence in the case that everyone can agree upon is genuine. The pictures of Major Marcel, General Ramey, and Colonel DuBose holding the tinfoil trash, those pictures are not taken in Roswell. For the love of God, I can't believe some of the prominent people who are out there saying these pictures are taken in Roswell. They're not. They're taken in Fort Worth, Texas. And so those are my 2 big ones. Let's see, what's the third one? Well, the third one is this. It did not crash in Roswell. In fact, the debris that we can all agree upon, found by rancher Mac Brazel, is a 60-mile straight line distance from Roswell, at least. The most direct driving route to get there is almost 100 miles, depending on where in the town of Roswell you are. And so when you read in the 1994 Air Force investigation of Captain Sheridan Cavett, basically describing how, not even being led there by the rancher, he claims he never met the rancher, but going out there into that wilderness of land, that bewildering non-flat land, on verbal directions alone, not to find a 3/4 mile long debris field like Major Marcel said it was, but Captain Cavett, the Air Force's star a weather balloon witness, says it was maybe no bigger than his living room. He goes out there, having been in Roswell for less than a week, to a piece of land he's never been to without a guide to take him somewhere, and he finds a bullseye 20 feet across, and he picks it up, and he's back home in time for dinner. We're supposed to believe that that's the true story. It doesn't even pass muster, pass the laugh test. So some of that becomes obvious as you spend time out here, as you actually go out to that place. So those are I think some key important takeaways that I think everybody needs to know. If you're gonna be
political drama distractions aren't helpful, and we should focus on real solutions like.
Thank you, Paul. That was brilliant.
I see Elon Musk was joining us.
Yeah, he's trying to chime in there. I think that, he could be using reverse engineered Roswell parts in his SpaceX and Teslas there.
And you know what my philosophy is, that war and money provide incredible incentive for human ingenuity to actually create amazing things. I mean, I'm not going to rule out that we ever reverse engineered anything, but I'm not adamant that we have. I don't know what the evidence for that is. So I don't lean in that direction. I think people are really smart, and I think global wars such as we had World War II really stimulate rapid innovation.
For sure. And we have Death John with a question.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Paul. Hey, so just starting off, my grandmother, she actually was born in Roswell in 1940. And,
is she still alive?
I asked her. Yeah, she is. And I asked her questions about it all the time. I asked her to, corroborate stories. I think there was, a fire marshal that, there's a lot of reports on a fire marshal that had to go out and look at it. So I asked her a lot of questions, and she totally says that basically the government did cover it up. But the real question I wanted to ask you is are you familiar with Dr. James McDonald and his research?
Sadly, I'm not familiar enough.
Okay. Well, so Dr. James McDonald was a Arizona State researcher, and he got his PhD and was their main professor for weather science. And in 1950s, he really started doing investigations on UFO reportings in the 1950s.
Yes.
And he was there against dang it, it's drawing a mind blank. But anyways, he was Dr. James McDonald. He has an actual still today at Arizona State, an actual whole library full of all of his investigations dating back from the 50s all the way to 69. And oddly enough, he actually has a reporting of a sighting the day before of two crafts that were flying around Utah. And oddly enough, it's the same descriptions as what ended up happening the next day. But more importantly, if you actually think about this guy, Dr. James McDonald, okay, this guy was very smart, very, very, very intellectual, and studied the weather a lot. Okay, this guy was getting his PhD in the 30s on weather, on weather and formation, everything. So I find it extremely interesting that a guy that was basically a world-renowned scientist in weather would have known about Roswell and would have known what weather balloons actually would have been. He would have used weather balloons to, put together his dissertation for his own PhD. And for a leading scientist at Arizona State in weather to then basically shift all his resources and focus onto UFOs and researching all UFO reportings, to me is a sign that actually a leading scientist for weather could have debunked that, or he could have actually said, yeah, that was a weather balloon. But instead, no, this guy went on to being one of the first UFO like researchers of our
Well,
time, and it hit.
that is an interesting observation. Couldn't he have gotten involved and offered some explanation? I don't recall when he died. If I recall correctly, James McDonald is the luminary of early UFO research who actually committed suicide, basically twice. He
Yes.
attempted suicide. He actually survived from it, but was horribly incapacitated from that failed attempt, and then some time later succeeded in committing suicide. Of course, you have to remember the Roswell story is well and truly buried within the very week that it's first put out there in 1947. Nobody's paying attention to it in the UFO community. The authors who are doing the research into UFOs in its heyday in the 50s and the 60s, nobody puts out anything. I think there's it may actually be from the early 70s. There's an encyclopedia of events from 1947 that mentions it, that goes so far as to actually mention Roswell occurred, but it's basically a 2-sentence mention that just captures the way it's all dismissed. It was a misunderstanding by the military, nothing but a weather balloon. And then you have Frank Edwards in Flying Saucers, Serious Business in 1966. I actually have a first edition hardback copy of that, which I found a few months ago. It's really cool. And he's got basically a 2-paragraph mention of the Roswell incident, but it's like the Roswell incident as seen through a funhouse mirror. Every single fact is wrong, right? He gets it all mixed up. But the shadow of the event is there, and I mean that's it. And even Stanton Friedman in 1974, 4 years before he meets Major Marcel, Stanton Friedman comes across Lydia Sleppy, the radio station employee up in Albuquerque, who heard from a Roswell reporter that he had been out to the crash site. He'd seen the craft, and she tries to get the story out on the AP Newswire. And the Newswire, in her telling, receives a message which says, cease transmission, this is a national security matter. Stanton Friedman learns this story in 1974. He publishes a very short blurb about it in a UFO magazine. He doesn't specify the year. He doesn't use the word Roswell. And there's no further follow-up until he meets Major Marcel in 1978. And even then, Stan Friedman doesn't really do anything with it until early 79. So the Roswell story, even amongst UFO researchers, is just dead and buried and ignored and treated as exactly the way it was finally spun in the press during that big week. A mistaken identity over a weather balloon, and it's left at that. I don't know if, like I said, sadly, I don't know enough about James McDonald's work. And so I don't know if he ever would have been aware of the Roswell incident.
Yeah, so I'd like to add a little bit more about Dr. James McDonald, because you're right. He did have two suicide attempts, the second one unfortunately being successful. But this was basically after, one, his wife had left him, and two is because he was kind of also being exiled as an academic professor who was also on record of going against J. Allen Hynek's, opinion on the whole Project Blue Book and everything like that. Like he's on record of arguing against J. Allen Hynek after he denounced basically Project Blue Book's work or whatever. And in addition to that, he was also at a lot of he was at an event with Carl Sagan too, back in 1968 or sometime in the 60s, whenever Carl Sagan was even attending some of these UFO events. So as far as his acknowledgement of Roswell, I believe that that's actually how he would have gotten interested into the whole subject, and that he would have actually known, because he would have known whether that was an actual weather balloon or not.
Yeah,
And like I said,
I think that's a good point, Death.
Uh-oh, I heard internet quit. I'd like to learn more about James McDonald. Sadly, my comprehension of some of the luminaries of the early UFO field is pretty minimal. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you had a good point there about the weather.
But yeah, just that
balloon, though.
you've got a weather scientist who's suddenly interested in UFOs. Yeah, that's interesting.
So he's got a full archive available at Arizona State. Anybody can check it out, and it's even online. So you can go through his archive actually just online, Arizona State, Dr. James McDonald archive. Simple
Do
Google.
you know if he
and
ever
you can go to town
commented
with it.
on Roswell?
Whenever I went through his archives, I do not remember any statements on Roswell, but it's because he didn't get started into being a serious UFO person until like 1955.
Yeah. So after the Washington Nationals.
So his archive is strictly on his own personal research from 1955 to like 1969. So
And thanks for bringing that to us, Death, John. And I'm going to go ahead and get to Darius
Hey,
and then
real
Juan.
quick. Sorry, Tim.
Sure.
Death John, I sent you a direct message. I'd love to learn more about your grandmother.
Sounds good, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Death. Go ahead, Darius.
Hey there, guys. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on an observation I made of, just thinking about Roswell. I just recently read the book by Lou Elizondo, and he brought the subject up 80 years later. It seems like the government is willing to let some of the information out about Roswell. I mean, he even went so far as to, say, hey, two crafts crashed and we recovered one, stuff that was cleared for him to say. I think it's interesting with the government being what it is. The government knows and checks backgrounds on anyone that they would have as a counterintelligence agent or anyone working with a high security clearance. They're going to look into the background and make sure that the person is a good fit for the job. Now, Lou Elizondo on this book tour that he's doing keeps emphasizing the fact that his background is in sciences. And mine is, I'd studied biology, but he was as he puts it, he was a parapsychologist. And he always clarifies, not parapsychology, like, as in, the woo, but parasites. I studied parasites. Now, the clue number one is, why would the government put a guy like him in charge of ATIP and be like a leading forefront voice on disclosure? A guy that studies parasites. And then, you think back to some of his previous talks before the book, where on his Kurt Jaimungal podcast with millions of views, he, famously posited that, hey, human beings might be in for, just paraphrasing him, ontological shock, to understand that we're not at the top of the food chain. When he said that, that made the biology major in my background ears, kind of perk up. Okay, not the top of the food chain is kind of a weird way to put that. But this is a guy that's got a background in studying parasites. He's cleared to talk about something that happened 80 years ago that the government's clearly covering up. So there's something negative going on here. And, it makes me think about like a lot of the theories about loosh being farmed. And then you hear about the stuff from Q about adrenochrome and all this different stuff that people can feed off of, or these entities or whatnot. I think there's something to that. Not so much the loosh or there's always like a little kernel of truth in a lot of the stuff that they drop. And I really think that it's kind of odd that they got a parapsychology guy that studies parasites leading disclosure and allowing him to come out with information that basically is verifying that Yeah, the government lied about Roswell. It was 80 years ago. Let's get past it. Just wondering what you guys' thoughts are on that.
Thanks, Paul. What do you think about that?
Well, sadly, even though I have my copy of Imminent and it's sitting right there, I have not had the opportunity to read through what he said. I'm a little confused in his recent appearances where, with Ross Coulthart, he said it was two craft, one flew away. I think it was on the Daily Show or the Comedy Central thing. He said it was a craft that broke into two pieces. Well, which is it? I mean, those aren't mutually exclusive necessarily, but why is he changing his description? I don't know what to make of his descriptions of these things, and I should probably withhold judgment until I've had a chance to read his entire book, which I have not. I am just, as a blanket rule, I am skeptical. Maybe skeptical is the wrong word, but I certainly do not jump on and agree that a pronouncement from someone who's in government today is necessarily going to be good information or true about the Roswell case. I am very devoted to researching what we can learn from people who were here at the time, from where the provenance is clear. We know they were here. We know their testimony is coming from a place of some level of firsthand involvement. I worry, I'll put it that way, I worry that pronouncements from people in government today, if they are not cleared to show us a document that we can all look at and agree upon, yeah, that looks genuine, as the source of their information, I just worry that they're just passing along the game of telephone. I can't say that about Lou Elizondo's book because, you know, most of what I'm aware of from the book comes from the excerpt that was leaked, and I looked at what he had to say about Roswell there, and from things he's saying in just some of the snippets that have been passed around on X of his media appearances. So if it's not firsthand testimony, it's just one more thing that I put over there into, like Stan Friedman called it, the gray box or the gray folder. Certainly not anything that I'm going to use to fashion my reconstruction of how I believe the event unfolded.
I think that's good advice, Paul. And this might be our last question of the night. Juan?
Yeah, thanks for letting me speak. Sorry if there's some noise in the background. I'm walking my dog right now. Just two questions for Paul. So my first question is, obviously you've got, boots on the ground there in Roswell. I'm curious, have you ever heard any theories about what actually brought the craft down? That's one question. And two is, you mentioned earlier that you spoke to some witnesses that some of these accounts have never been made public. I'm just curious, out of those witnesses, how do they describe the beings? There's obviously this idea that they could have been EBEs, right, extraterrestrial biological entities, or grays, human-like potentially. There's a lot of theories, right? So I'm just curious, of those accounts that have never been made public, can you describe, what those people told you, did the humanoids look like? So those are my two questions.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I got to disappoint you. No, I've never talked to anybody who had a family story that described the look of the beings. I don't think I've ever come across that. Other than, and I need to follow up with this witness who would be the son of someone who was intimately involved. That witness might have told me just that they were small, which is literally as far as it goes. So unfortunately, I've never talked to anybody or come across any sort of untold tales that have the ring of truth to them that describe the bodies. So can't help you there. Wish I could. As to the question of how and why the thing crashes, here's the way I look at that. I spent 16 years investigating car crashes, putting together reconstructions of automobile accidents, developing an opinion to a reasonable degree of engineering certainty to withstand scrutiny in a court of law, right? That's sort of the lingo of what we had to do. In such cases, you always begin with a contemporary document generated by an accredited law enforcement officer who is at the scene, at the time, at the moment, the immediate aftermath of the crash. And then you have pictures. You have pictures of the gouges in the road. You have pictures of the tire marks going off into the grass. You have pictures of the damage to the vehicles. And then you have a chance to go and actually lay hands on the damaged vehicles, usually. And then after all of that, you have, and sometimes these days you have actual video of the event occurring, but then after all of that, then you have witness testimony. In the Roswell case, all we have is the witness testimony. I don't care what people say the thing looked like, what people speculate on what was going on and why it might have crashed. I am not going to subscribe to the idea that it was struck by lightning. I am not going to subscribe to the idea that we knocked it out of the sky with our radar. I'm not going to subscribe to the idea that P-61 Black Widows shot it out of the skies. And I'm not going to subscribe to the idea that two craft, for whatever reason, collided into each other, one of which became a shower of wreckage on Brazel's land, and the other one of which crashes on the plains of San Agustin. I'm not going to say any of those is impossible, that I'm not going to subscribe to any of those ideas because I don't have the first shred of forensic evidence of what the thing looked like, how it operated, and what damage it left on the ground, and what its actual materials looked like. All I have is witness testimony. And so my ethical standards, I cannot put forward what I think is the most likely explanation for any of that because I don't definitively know the first thing about the craft. I just don't. So that's where I default back to the way my career ethics were as a professional engineer, as an investigator of car crashes, putting together accident reconstructions. You just don't offer your opinion if you don't have that kind of data to start from. So, yes, I can't help you, Juan.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you for your answers. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul, that was great. And I want to thank you again so much for joining us tonight. Thanks to Astral again. Shout out to Astral for allowing us to be a part of UFO Twitter Week and this space, all things Roswell. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. Please check out our YouTube channel at All Things Unexplained. We've got some exciting things coming up soon, and I hope you'll check them out. Please follow Paul. He's a wealth of knowledge. He's always sharing really great things on his Twitter account. And please check out the Roswell UFO Tour, led by Paul himself. Paul, thanks so much for joining us tonight. It was amazing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Mounts, for inviting me. And this was a lot of fun, and I hope we can do it again.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Like I said, get off your phones, head out into the woods, go star watching, look up at the sky. You might not find Bigfoot, you might not see a UFO, but you might just find yourself out there somewhere. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
All things unexplained.
What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
Dr. Taylor was revealed to be the chief scientist of the UAP task force with the Pentagon.
So some of that, I think, sir, will save for closed session.
All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounts' books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show.